So in this video, I'll be walking you guys through the steps necessary to get your images transferred onto your block. So when you get your block, it looks like this. Again, it's an 8 by 10 inch piece of battleship grade linoleum. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. So as I said in the previous video, linoleum is made out of a mixture of cork and resin and has this jute backing on it. And again, it's pretty thin. So one of the things you need to do to kind of start off with to get your block ready, you'll notice this one has some little kind of stray hairs or fibers on it. Also, if you kind of run your finger along the surface of your block, a lot of times it'll have some little kind of flecks or just kind of debris pieces of the block on there that I kind of raised up. So you want to get rid of that so you have a nice smooth surface. So you just kind of take your fingernails and try to pick off in those little dried hard pieces that are sitting on the surface of your block. You could also use something like a palette knife to scrape it, or just your fingernails works fine. But something, not metallic, but just has a hard edge to it, like a palette knife would work really well, just to scrape off. Again, those little dried bits and pieces that are kind of stuck to the surface of your block. All right, so we got all those off. So just take some scissors next, and we'll just kind of trim off some of these fibers, these kind of hairs that are sticking off the edge here. And we'll just get all those cut off. If you don't trim these, they're gonna have a tendency to want to pick up and hold ink. So, if you forget to do this initially off the bat, you could always do this later before you're actually gonna start printing. But ideally, do all this stuff beforehand so you don't have to worry about it later. You've already got it done, so that way the block has been prepped and it's ready to go ahead and get your image transferred over to your block. So yeah, just use some regular scissors to trim off these little stray hairs or fibers off all the edges. And sometimes more fibers will show up later, just as you're carving on the block. Some of the fibers on the back from the jute backing might kind of loosen up and come off. If that's the case, again, just before you actually get ready to start doing your printing, just make sure to address those and trim any little fibers that might show up. So that looks pretty good. So you got most of it trimmed off, right? So it's nice and smooth now. Got all the edges trimmed up so we won't have any fibers or hair sticking out. So for this video, I'm actually doing this on one of the work tables in 316. I'll actually prefer that you guys do this in the press room over in 314. There's a long black table that you guys can use for this purpose, but just a demonstration for my video setup, this is where I'm doing it. Just from experience, one thing that I've found in terms of getting an image to transfer to this block better is to prime it. And to do that, I just have a paper towel and I have a little bit of vegetable oil, which is in these plastic containers. It has a little squirt top on it. So I'm just going to squirt a little bit directly onto my paper towel, and I'm just going to apply that to my block, to your entire surface of the block, to the top side, not the side that has the backing, but to the top side of the block. And I'm just going to work this in really good so I'm getting the entire block covered just with a really thin film of the oil. I don't want to completely saturate this, so for that reason I wouldn't suggest pouring the oil directly to the block so that you don't overdo it, oversaturate your block. Really all I'm trying to do is just basically make like a really thin film. So once I get the whole block covered with an initial pass of the oil, I'm just going to go back with a clean part of my paper towel and actually start removing the excess oily residue. I don't really want to leave any kind of residue at all. Really all this is doing is just it's kind of conditioning the block a little bit. And like I said, just from experience, it seems like conditioning the block initially with a little bit of vegetable oil just makes the block much more receptive to the photocopy toner that we're going to be using to offset onto our blocks here in just a second. This is one of many methods that you can potentially use to transfer an image to a block. So this particular technique is one that's just much more kind of quick and takes some of the guesswork out of it for you. So your image as it appears on the block will actually be mirrored or reversed from what your final sketch or image was, so that whenever we actually run it through the press and print it, the image will actually get flipped from the block and will be in the correct orientation. So You could potentially, transfer your image by just drawing directly onto the block, typically with like a permanent marker or a waterproof pen, something like that. But again, you have to take into account that the image is actually going to be, reversed when printed. You could also potentially use something like graphite transfer paper, sterile transfer paper as a way to transfer an image onto it. Again, in that case, you would want to have your image actually printed out in reverse because in the case of a graphite transfer paper or like a sterile transfer paper, you're physically transferring that directly onto the block surface. So for that reason, you would need your image to actually be flipped, right? So the mirrored or opposite orientation of what your intentions are, and then you would put your graphite paper down onto the block, put your image face up on top of that, and then sort of trace over it. So this is a much more kind of simple and direct method I'm going to show you guys here in just a second, again, which is why I prefer to do it this way. It's very simple, it's direct, and again, takes that guesswork out of it for you. So to do this, I have a fresh photocopy, this little Godzilla head drawing that I made a while back. So for this to work, it has to be a fresh photocopy. It has to be done from a black and white laser printer. It cannot be done from an inkjet printer. So it has to be a black and white laser printer, okay? So whenever you guys are ready to actually transfer images to your blocks, you can do that up here in Grinstead. What I found gives the best results is actually using the black and white printer that is across the hall from us up here in 316, over in 317, so the classroom directly across the hall from the printmaking studio, and use that black and white printer. The toner on that printer is just richer, it's darker, and tends to work better with this technique. So we do have a black and white printer here in the shop in 316, but like I said, just from experience, the one over in 317, the HP printer tends to work better. So again, this has to be a fresh photocopy. It has to be printed that day. Ideally, you want to transfer this, within like an hour, 2 at most. Because essentially what we're doing is that we're using that photocopier toner, and that is what's actually being transferred or offset onto our block itself. So for that to work optimally, it's got to be a fresh photocopy. Before you actually print out your image, again, when you're printing it out, you're just printing it out in the normal orientation. So print it out the way that you want it to look. Make sure that it is scaled to the size of your block, which is 8 by 10. And also to kind of make things a little bit easier, if you go under the print dialog box before you send it to the printer, if you scroll down, you'll see an option for printing marks. If you select corner crop marks, that'll help you be able to know where to cut down your paper. If you have an image that is, a full bleed image that extends all the way to the edges, it's kind of easier to identify and define where the edges of your image are, and so it's easier to cut down. If you don't have that image like this, right, where it's kind of more centralized and there's a lot of negative space around it, it can be harder to identify or know where the boundaries of your image are. So in that case, again, you would want to have some crop marks there to help you know where to cut this down. Again, fresh photocopy, black and white laserjet print. Cut down the excess paper. So this is cut down to my 8 by 10 target size for my block. So after I printed it, I immediately took it over to the table using X-Acto knife and a straight edge to cut off the excess paper. So now I have my cut down fresh 8 by 10 laserjet photocopy. It's ready to go. So to transfer this, we're using this stuff here. It is oil of wintergreen, methyl salicylate. So this stuff is mildly toxic, so it's important that you're always wearing gloves and we're handling this material, and really you should be wearing gloves at all times in the shop whenever you're handling any of these materials or inks, things like that. So just be in the habit of making sure that you're wearing gloves. So we have a couple of these larger bottles, again, of the oil of wintergreen, the methyl salicylate, which I actually buy from a veterinary supply company. It's used for horses. It can be used as like a topical analgesic, so it's good for like sore muscles. It's used in some foods and drinks as well. Obviously, for flavoring like mints, candy, gum, that kind of thing. It's also used as one of the flavoring ingredients in root beer. So in small amounts, it is relatively safe to handle and obviously to drink or ingest. But this is a pure version of that oil of wintergreen. So obviously don't drink it. And again, be careful when you're handling it. So wearing gloves is always a good idea. So rather than using that big bottle, I'll have some of these small containers available for you guys to use in the shop. And so they'll be labeled so that we know what's in them, so we can identify what this mystery liquid is. So this is a small container that has some of this, again, methyl salicylate, oil of wintergreen in it. All right, so to apply it, we're going to use a foam brush. So the thing though is we can only really use these 2 to 3 times before they just start to get kind of overloaded with the wintergreen oil and sort of balloon out, and then they're just not really useful anymore. They have to be tossed. So we can use these a few times, like I said, and then eventually it's going to be thrown away. So I've got that. The other thing that I have here handy is I've got some burnishing tools. So I just have basically a old wooden spoon, which works really well, especially when I do kind of my initial passes. I'll use a wooden spoon and then switch over to the bone folder here. So we'll use both of those here in just a moment to actually burnish the image to get that to get a nice solid transfer of our image onto our blocks here. So I'm gonna take my sponge brush and I'm just going to kind of stick it in my wintergreen oil here. I'm going to wick off the excess right on the lip on the edge of this container, and I'm just going to apply this directly to my block, and sort of like the vegetable oil, just a nice thin even coating. And I just loaded the brush once, and that was enough for me to get the amount of wintergreen oil on my brush that I need. So now I'm just kind of going back over it sort of in horizontal passes to make sure that it's covering the entire things. I'm getting all the way out to the edges. I don't have any areas that aren't getting covered. So we got the whole thing covered with the wintergreen oil. It looks like it's again pretty evenly covered. You don't want it to be too heavy or too thick. If it is, then when you put your image down, it's going to have a tendency to bleed, and then that's going to make it difficult to kind of sort out your image if it's all kind of bleedy and kind of lose those nice kind of defined lines and edges. Also, if it's not enough, if it's undercoated, then it's not going to transfer as well either. So you kind of have to hit that sweet spot where, again, just a nice kind of thin, even coating on there. If you're in doubt, ask me, of course, but if it seems like it's too thick, you could always just try to wipe some of the excess oil off of your sponge brush, kind of go back over it, try to wick up some of the excess oil. Obviously, if it's undercoated, just get a little bit more on your brush, hit it with a second pass, and that should take care of it. But again, if you're unsure, just ask me, or again, you can try to use the brush to either remove some excess or add some more if you need to. So we're going to take our photocopy, and I'm just going to position it over my block and put it face down directly onto the block. So try to be as careful as you can with this because you kind of only get one shot in terms of placing it. So just place it right directly over your block. Once it's on there, just kind of take the side of your hand, take your fingers and kind of smooth it out so that it's making good contact. You don't want to have any air bubbles. Try as best you can not to shift your paper as you're positioning it on the block. If you do that, it'll create kind of like a double drop or like kind of a shaky looking image. So again, it's a little daunting, but you can do it. Just be confident, be brave, right? Just try to get it lined up as best you can, drop it on there, and commit to it. So if you do, for some reason, mess up, it's not the end of the world. Basically, we could just take some more vegetable oil that we use to condition and prime our block. We can take like a sponge with a rough edge or like a pot scrubber and use the vegetable oil in that pot scrubber to kind of scrub off the image. As long as we get to it kind of immediately, it'll come off without too much effort. And then we'll just clean off the paper towel and try it again. So if you do mess up, again, not the end of the world. It's not a huge problem. We'll just scrub off the image using vegetable oil and try it again. So again, just take your fingers, take your hands, and try to get this kind of smoothed out so it's making good contact. Try to avoid creating any air bubbles or wrinkles as best you can. So once it's on there, I like to use, like I said, this wooden spoon to do an initial pass just over the entire image, just to kind of get it to stick. So as I'm doing that, I'm using my non-dominant hand. I'm using, in this case, my left hand because I'm a righty. I'm using that hand to try to trap the paper as I'm moving along, so it doesn't shift. So the same as whenever you're lining this up. As you're burnishing your image, it's important that you're trying to be careful not to shift your paper, because that can cause some problems. So yeah, just kind of do this in a circular motion, especially if your image extends all the way out to the edges. If you have a full bleed image where that image goes all the way out to the edge, you want to make sure that you're addressing those edges, and that you're getting all the way out to the edge of your paper into your block to ensure that you get a good transfer in those areas. All right, so after doing that initial pass, now we'll move over to this bone folder here, and apply a little bit more pressure. And so I'm just kind of using my fingertips and just using kind of the broad flat side of this. So I'm not really using like the more pointed tip. I'm not using the tip down here. I'm trying to use as much surface area as I can with the bone folder, and just using my fingertips on all four of my fingers to apply a good bit of pressure and push down. And I'm doing this like in a big circular motion. And again, I am applying a fair amount of pressure at this point, but still trying to be careful not to allow my block or my paper to move. So using my other hand to trap the paper as I'm moving along. So just continue burnishing, going around your entire image. Again, if your image extends to the edges, make sure you're getting all the way out to the edge of your paper. If you get to the point where you've been doing it for a while and you want to just kind of check and see how things are progressing, you can carefully just sort of peel up one of the corners and kind of take a little peek at it and see how it looks. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. I do a little bit more just kind of up here at the top. That area looks like it's a little bit light. So if you do peel up the corner to take a little peek at it to check on your progress, just really be careful to make sure that you don't shift the paper, and then just place the paper carefully back down. And if you need to continue to burnish in any areas, you can continue to do so for a bit more. I think this looks pretty good. I'm just doing one more quick pass. Make sure I got everything here in the middle. All right, so go ahead and peel this up. It looks pretty good. So when you guys, again, you're going to actually be doing this not here in 316, you'll be doing this preferably in the press room in 314. And so the red and yellow waste containers that are in there, anything that has solvents on it, so like this, for example, since it has the wintergreen oil on there, we want to make sure that we dispose of this, not in the regular trash can, but in those red and yellow waste containers. So this will go in there. Newsprint, anything else that you're using, paper towels, anything that has that oil residue on there needs to make sure that it finds its way, again, into those red and yellow containers. So it looks pretty good. We got a pretty nice clean transfer. I'm pretty happy with that. So before we can actually do any carving on this, we need to first heat set it so that the toner, because it's still very tacky, as you can kind of see there, if I press my finger on it, the toner is kind of coming off on my glove there, right? So in order to set this, we'll just use the hair dryer. So there's usually a hair dryer parked over in the press room in 314, back on top of the hot plate. There's a heat gun there as well, but the hair dryer is adequate. The heat gun's kind of a little overkill, so the hair dryer is just fine. So just hit it with the hair dryer for a couple of minutes, again, just to heat set it so that the toner doesn't have as much of a tendency to want to smudge on you. Especially if you have an image with a lot of black, it's going to take a little bit longer. So yeah, just make sure you heat set it with the hair dryer for a few minutes until, if you're just touching with your fingertip, nothing is coming off on your finger. And once you do that, then you're ready to start carving. So that'll be the next video.